The next step that we want to take in setting up our hierarchy is to take a look at something called gimbal rotations. And this really comes into play when you're animating an articulated hierarchy such as this. Let's select one of these shoulder objects, getting close on that, and grab the rotate tool. And if we're in local coordinate space, that seems to indicate that we're operating in the space of the object. And if I rotate around X, we can see that that object is aligned with the rotate gizmo. You can see that more clearly here as I move to the front. Well, local mode seems like a good idea for animation. And generations of animators in 3D have been using local mode forever. However, local mode is actually really problematic. And that's because it's kind of a fake coordinate space. It's not the actual coordinate space of the object. It looks like it is, but it isn't really. And to illustrate that, I want to open up the Transform Type In dialog. And that is a little floating window that shows us the transform values, similar to what we see down here in the Transform Type In area. But this is just going to give us a lot more control. So I'm going to right-click on the Rotate tool, and we have the Transform Type In dialog. And this shows us the values in the currently selected transform coordinate space or reference coordinate space. Interestingly, if you're in local mode, and for example, you rotate in an axis, notice that although we're seeing the object rotate, we're seeing the numbers update in that heads-up display, but the Transform Type In dialog shows values of 0. And that's just kind of a quirk of 3ds Max. The Transform Type In dialog in local space is always going to show values of 0. I'm going to undo that with Control-Z. Going up here and changing this to a different reference coordinate system, let's try parent. And that's a useful one because when we rotate an object or transform or scale it, in reality, we're actually rotating and scaling it in its parent coordinate space, not in its own local space. Currently, this object does not have a parent, and so the parent is the world. And when I choose parent, I'm actually really working in world coordinate space. This is telling me what the absolute rotation values of that object are. Okay, now let's see what the issue is when we work in either local or any other mode. I'm going to turn off my angle snaps, and I'll go over here and rotate in Y, which is the green circle here. And that looks fine, okay? Undo that, Control-Z. Let's try rotating in X, which is the red circle. And although I'm thinking I'm only rotating in one axis, because I've only selected the red axis, look at what's going on in that Rotate Transform Type In dialog. It's actually rotating the object in all 3 axes. This is actually a real problem, because if you rotate in local mode or parent mode, you might think that you're only animating in one axis, when in fact, under the hood, you're actually rotating in 2 or even 3 axes. And you might say, oh, well, whatever. How does that matter? Why do I care? Well, you care because if you're actually keyframing or animating in 3 axes simultaneously, then you cannot control the behavior of the object. And what will happen is that if you make subsequent keyframes or animation key points, then the object will animate in 3 axes at once, and it will move in unpredictable directions. And generations of 3D animators have bashed their heads against their computer screens when this happened. They rotate in one axis, they make a keyframe, and they think they're good, and they play the animation back, and the object spins uncontrollably wildly and just goes crazy. All right, so there is a solution to this, and that is that we want to make sure that we're only rotating in one axis at a time. I'll undo that rotation that I just did. And the key here is to switch over to the reference coordinate system labeled Gimbal. And that is the magic solution to all these problems. I never use local coordinate space. I never use parent coordinate space. Whenever animating rotations, I'm always in gimbal space. And now if I rotate around the x-axis, only the x-axis updates. Or if I rotate around the y-axis, only y updates. Likewise with z. This is super important, And if you are in gimbal mode when you do rotations, you'll actually be able to control the rotations, and you can keyframe in a single axis and not have your objects spin around in crazy directions. By the way, if you're wondering what a gimbal is, it's a real-world object. It's a series of 3 interlocking rings that's used to do things like stabilize a compass in an airline cockpit as the airplane tilts up and down and goes in different directions. So the gimbal mode here evokes the actual real gimbal in the real world because we have 3 rings here, 1 for each axis. All right, so the moral of the story here is that if you want to have predictable rotations, always use gimbal mode.